The message arrived at 3 in the morning, and I knew before I read it that everything was over. My name is Daniel Shaw. I was a mid-level officer in Earth's Orbital Defense Division, the kind of person nobody remembers in peacetime. I had a desk, I had clearance, I had a coffee mug with a chip on the rim that I never replaced, because replacing it felt like admitting I cared about my job more than I should. None of that matters now. What matters is the file that appeared on my terminal at 3:14 in the morning on a Tuesday in March, sent from a trade relay that should not have existed, encrypted in a format that should not have been readable, containing a document that should not have been real. It was a list. 73 names, species names, each one followed by a date and a single word, in a language I had never seen, but which our translation software rendered into English without hesitation. The word was scheduled. The Drusi, scheduled. The Pelhari, scheduled. The Ixi, the Farani, the Qeth, the Halani. 72 names I had never heard of, cultures I had never encountered, worlds I could not have pointed to on any star chart. And at the bottom, number 73, in plain text that needed no translation at all, Earth. Scheduled. I called my commanding officer, a woman named Claire Whitman who had spent 20 years in intelligence and had the personality of a locked filing cabinet. She answered on the second ring, which told me she already knew. She told me to come in. She did not say please. She did not explain. When I arrived at the operations center 40 minutes later, there were already 9 people in the room, and every single one of them looked like they had aged a decade since dinner. The file had been sent by an alien trade contact named Saloon, a Rethki merchant who had been running black market technology exchanges with a handful of human governments for almost 30 years. The Rethki were small, quiet, and terrified of everything. They survived in the galaxy by being useful and invisible. Saloon had been useful to us. Now Saloon was being something else entirely. Saloon was being brave, and I could tell from the encryption patterns that Saloon's hands had been shaking when the message was sent. Claire laid it out for us in under 10 minutes. The Valith Ascendancy, a collective so old that most species considered them a force of nature rather than a government, conducted periodic operations they called purge corridors. Every few centuries, they identified species they deemed unsuitable for continued existence, too primitive, too aggressive, too chaotic, too anything the Ascendancy decided was unacceptable that particular millennium, and they sent a fleet called the Silence Fleet to erase them. Not conquer, not enslave, erase. The worlds were sterilized, the records were deleted, the names were removed from every galactic database. It was as if those species had never drawn breath. I remember sitting in that room, listening to Claire's voice, which never wavered, never cracked, never rose above the same flat tone she used to order lunch, and I remember thinking that I should feel something enormous. Terror, rage, grief. But what I felt was smaller than any of those things. What I felt was the quiet, cold understanding that we were not special. We were not being targeted because we were dangerous, or important, or threatening. We were number 73, the last entry on a list, an afterthought. The galaxy's most powerful civilization was going to wipe out the human race, and we were not even important enough to go first. Over the next 6 weeks, we watched the list shrink. The Droon were first. They were a spacefaring civilization with a population of 11 billion spread across 4 worlds. The Silence Fleet arrived in their home system on a Wednesday. By Friday, there was nothing left. No distress calls, no debris fields, no refugee ships. Just silence. The kind of silence that has weight to it, that presses against your ears, that makes you check your equipment 3 times, because surely something must be broken. Surely there must be some signal, some echo, some proof that 11 billion living beings had existed 48 hours ago. Then the Pelhari, then the Ixi, then 4 more species in rapid succession, names I was only beginning to learn how to pronounce, gone before I could finish reading their files. The Silence Fleet moved through the purge corridor like a surgeon moving through a checklist, efficient, methodical, utterly without hesitation. Each erasure took between 2 and 5 days. There was no negotiation. There was no warning beyond the list itself. There was no mercy, because mercy requires the recognition that the other party matters, and the Ascendancy did not recognize that. Governments on Earth responded the way governments always respond to existential threats. Badly. Half of them denied the list was real. A quarter of them began building bunkers that everyone knew would not survive orbital bombardment. A handful proposed surrender, which required someone to surrender to, and the ascendancy did not accept communications from scheduled species. The United Nations held an emergency session that lasted 9 hours and produced a joint statement expressing deep concern, which I read aloud to my team in the operations center, because I thought if I did not laugh, I would start screaming. Claire Whitman did not laugh. Claire Whitman pulled me into her office, closed the door, and told me I was being promoted. Not because I deserved it, she said, but because the 3 people above me in the chain of command had resigned in the last week, and the 2 people above them had stopped answering their phones. I was now the operational lead of something called Project Longshot, which had been proposed by a coalition of scientists, engineers, and one retired radio astronomer named Peter Holt, who had spent the last 40 years listening to the sky and hearing nothing, and who had decided that if the sky would not talk to us, we would talk to the sky. Project Longshot was not a weapon. It was not a shield. It was not a plan for survival, because no plan for survival existed. It was a communications array, the largest ever conceived, linking every deep space transmitter, radio telescope, satellite dish, and broadband antenna on the planet into a single synchronized network capable of producing one omnidirectional broadcast powerful enough to reach the far edges of the galaxy. One signal, one chance to say something before the silence fleet arrived and made sure we never said anything again. I asked Peter Holt what we were going to say. He looked at me with eyes that were red from exhaustion and bright with something I could not name, something between fury and sorrow, and a strange, fierce love for a species that had spent most of its history trying to destroy itself. And he said, "I have no idea, but we are going to say it louder than anything has ever been said." I set up operations in a facility beneath the Atacama Desert, chosen because it was remote, because it had existing infrastructure from the telescope arrays, and because nobody was fighting over it. Everywhere else on the planet, things were falling apart. Cities were emptying. Markets had collapsed. Half the internet was down because the people who maintained the servers had gone home to hold their families. I understood that. I wanted to go home too, but I did not have anyone to hold, and I had a project that needed a leader. And sometimes, the loneliest people are the most useful in a crisis because they have nothing left to lose except the work. My team was small at first. Claire Whitman handled intelligence and security. Peter Holt ran the technical side, the antenna synchronization, the signal architecture, the 1,000 small engineering miracles that had to happen for the array to function. A linguist named Grace Fielding, who had spent her career translating dead languages on Earth, and now found herself translating dead languages from the stars. A young engineer named Simon Drake, who was 26 years old and too stubborn to be afraid, or at least too stubborn to admit it. And me, 5 people in a bunker in the desert, trying to build a megaphone for a species that had not yet decided what to shout. The weeks bled into each other. Species 41 was erased. Then 45. Then 50. The silence fleet was accelerating, and every morning I woke up and checked the list the way a patient checks a tumor, knowing it would be worse, unable to stop looking. Each name that disappeared was a civilization I would never know, a history I would never read, a music I would never hear. I am not a sentimental person. I have never written poetry. I have never cried at a film. But I cried at my desk when Species 53 was erased, because Solun had sent us a fragment of their literature, and the last line of the last story they ever wrote, translated roughly to, "And in the morning, the children will play in the garden again." They had been optimists. They had believed in mornings. The ascendancy gave them an endless night. By the time Species 60 was gone, Project Longshot's antenna network was 40% complete, and I still did not know what we were going to say. The world's governments had stopped calling. Most of them had ceased to function in any meaningful way. Power grids were failing. Supply chains were broken. The people who came to work at the facility each day did so, not because anyone was paying them, not because anyone was ordering them, but because the alternative was sitting at home and waiting to die, And human beings, whatever else you can say about us, are terrible at waiting. I stood outside the bunker one evening and looked up at the sky. Somewhere out there, invisible and patient, the Silence Fleet was working its way down the list. 68 species gone, 4 more between us and oblivion. I had 11 weeks, a half-built antenna array, and a message I had not written. I went back inside, and I got to work, because the dead were piling up, and we still did not know what to say. I need to tell you about the dead, not how they died. That part is simple and terrible, and the same for all of them. The Silence Fleet arrived, and then there was nothing. No battles, no last stands, no heroes holding the line while civilians escaped. The Ascendancy had perfected extinction, the way a factory perfects a process. Every step optimized, every variable accounted for, every outcome predetermined. There was no room for heroism in the equation. There was only the before and the after was always silence. What I need to tell you about is what they left behind, what we found when we went looking, not for weapons or tactics or some secret vulnerability in the Ascendancy's fleet, but for the civilizations themselves, the people, the cultures, the things they made and thought and believed before the silence took them. It started with Grace Fielding. Grace had been working through the data archives Solune had smuggled to us, fragments of intercepted Ascendancy records, black market cultural databases traded between species who knew they were on borrowed time, scraps and echoes and footnotes. She came to me on a Tuesday morning, holding a tablet, and her hands were shaking, and Grace Fielding was not a person whose hands shook. She said, "Daniel, you need to see this." What she showed me was a musical composition, not the whole thing, just a fragment, maybe 3 minutes of a piece, that the original record suggested ran for over 6 hours. It was Drufun, the Drufun, species number 1 on the Purge Corridor Manifest, 11 billion souls erased in 48 hours. The Drufun had composed music using gravitational harmonics, vibrations generated by the interaction of celestial bodies, and they had translated those vibrations into sound, the way a pianist translates sheet music into movement. The fragment Grace played for me was haunting. It sounded like a conversation between 2 stars, slow and vast and achingly beautiful, and it had been written by a species that no longer existed anywhere in the universe except in this stolen file on a tablet in a bunker in the desert. I listened to it 3 times. Then I asked Grace what else she had found. What she had found broke me open. The Pelhari, species number 2, had developed a unified field theory 300 years before they were scheduled for erasure. They had solved one of the fundamental questions of physics, the relationship between gravity and quantum mechanics, and they had expressed it not in equations but in a visual language, a kind of mathematical art that conveyed both the proof and the beauty of the proof simultaneously. Their answer was elegant, it was revolutionary, and it was sitting in a smuggled data cache that nobody in the galaxy would ever read, because the Pelhari were gone, and the Ascendancy had scrubbed their work from every official database. The Ixi, species number 3, had developed a system of justice so sophisticated that Grace spent 2 days just parsing the foundational concepts. They had a word, untranslatable in any human language, that meant something close to the obligation of the strong to be questioned by the weak. It was the cornerstone of their legal system. The powerful were not judged by their peers, they were judged by those with the least power, because the Ixi believed that justice could only be measured from the bottom, never from the top. It was brilliant. It was humane in a way that the word humane had never quite captured, and it was dead. I pulled more people onto the research team, scientists, historians, linguists, musicians, artists, anyone who could help us understand what we were looking at. Within a week, we had 40 people working in a secondary chamber of the bunker, reading through the fragments of 70 dead civilizations, and the room was the quietest place I have ever been. Not because we enforced silence, but because nobody could speak. People would sit at their terminals, translating some fragment of alien philosophy or poetry or children's literature, and they would stop and press their hands against their mouths and breathe very carefully until they could continue. I remember Henry Marsh, a physicist from Edinburgh, calling me over to his station. He had found a fragment of Pelhari educational material, the equivalent of a children's textbook, explaining their unified field theory in simple terms. He said, "Daniel, they were teaching this to children. They had solved the deepest question in physics, and they made it so simple that a child could understand it, and now it is gone. We are looking at the last copy. This is the only place in the universe where this knowledge still exists, and in a few weeks, this place will be gone too." That was the moment the project changed. Not the antenna project. That was still grinding forward under Peter Holt's relentless supervision, the network growing a little larger each day as more dishes were brought online and more engineers arrived from collapsing institutions around the world, people who had nowhere else to go and chose to go somewhere that mattered. What changed was the message. I had been thinking about it wrong. We all had. We had been asking ourselves what humanity should say, as if this were our moment, our last words, our epitaph. But standing in that room full of people weeping over the fragments of murdered cultures, I realized that this was not about us. I gathered the team that evening. 43 people in a concrete room, exhausted, red-eyed, grieving for species they had never met. I told them what I wanted to do. I told them that the signal, Project Longshot, was not going to be a message from Earth. It was going to be a record, a complete record, as complete as we could make it, of every civilization the Ascendancy had ever silenced. Every equation, every song, every legal principle, every children's story, every fragment we could recover, compiled and transmitted in one massive broadcast to every corner of the galaxy. Not a plea, not a protest, a memorial. Grace Fielding was the first to speak. She said, "We do not have enough data. We have fragments, partial records, incomplete translations." I said, "Then we send fragments. We send what we have. Incomplete is better than erased." Simon Drake, the young engineer, said, "How do we organize it? We are talking about 70 different species, 70 different languages, 70 different systems of knowledge." A woman named Lucy Barrett, an archivist who had joined the team 3 days earlier, stood up. Lucy was 54 years old, had spent her career preserving historical documents, and had the calm, precise manner of someone who believed that information was sacred. She said, "We do not organize it. We let it be messy. We let it be raw. We let it be what it is, the last traces of living cultures, preserved by a species that found them in the wreckage and refused to look away." We called it the record. The work consumed us. Every hour of every day, the team translated, compiled, cross-referenced, and archived. We found fragments of 14 different musical traditions. We found mathematical proofs that human scientists said would advance our understanding of physics by centuries, if we had centuries. We found a QF poem cycle about the birth of stars that Grace translated with tears running down her face. Not because it was sad, but because it was joyful. Because the QF had looked at the violent birth of a star and seen something beautiful, and now the QF were ash. We found the Farani concept of shared dreaming, a neurological practice in which family groups linked their sleeping minds to experience collective visions. We found Halani architecture, buildings designed to grow and change over centuries, structures that were alive in a way that blurred the line between construction and cultivation. We found the ICSI legal arguments for the right of any conscious being to exist, arguments so carefully constructed, so logically irrefutable, that Henry Marsh said reading them felt like standing in a cathedral built entirely of reason. And we found the personal things, the small things, a Droon lullaby, 4 notes repeated in a pattern that shifted subtly each time, designed to match the breathing rhythm of a sleeping child, a Pelhari recipe for a food that no human would ever taste, described with such warmth and specificity that you could almost smell it, a Farani love letter, found in a personal data cache, that contained the untranslatable sentence Grace spent 3 days working on before she finally said, "The closest I can get is, I have walked beside you in every dream I have ever had, and I will walk beside you in every dream I will never have." I read that sentence, and I sat down on the floor of the bunker, and I did not move for a long time. We were not just building an archive, we were holding a funeral for the galaxy. Every fragment we recovered was a headstone, every translation was a eulogy, and we were the only mourners, because the rest of the universe was either dead or too afraid to grieve. On the 53rd day of the project, Solune sent another message. This one was not encrypted. It was not careful. It was a raw, panicked burst of data that Claire Whitman intercepted and decoded in under a minute. The Silence Fleet had deviated from its scheduled path. Species 72, a civilization called the Brene, who lived in a binary star system on the far side of the galactic arm, had been skipped. The fleet had changed course. It was heading directly for Sol. The timeline, which had given us 11 weeks, collapsed to 21 days. The antenna network was 60% complete. The record was perhaps half compiled. And the Silence Fleet was coming for us ahead of schedule, for reasons we did not understand and could not afford to wonder about. I stood in the operations center, looking at the updated trajectory projections on the main screen, and Claire Whitman stood beside me. And for the first and only time in the years I knew her, she put her hand on my shoulder. She did not say anything. She did not need to. We both knew what the new timeline meant. We were not going to finish the record. We were not going to have time to be thorough, to be complete, to be careful. We were going to have to send it raw, broken, imperfect, full of gaps and errors and untranslated passages, a half-built monument to civilizations that deserved a cathedral. I looked at Claire, and I said, "We send it as it is." She said, "It is not ready." I said, "The dead cannot wait." I stopped sleeping on day 55. Not by choice. My body simply refused. I would lie on the cot in my quarters, staring at the concrete ceiling, listening to the hum of the generators, and my mind would cycle through the same calculations over and over. 21 days had become 19. The antenna network was at 63%. The record was growing by the hour as the team worked without rest, pulling in fragments from every source Solune could provide, from intercepted ascendancy communications, from old trade databases, from the digital equivalent of messages in bottles that long-dead civilizations had cast into the void, hoping someone, anyone, would find them. On day 57, Peter Holt came to me with a problem that nearly ended everything. The antenna network, even at full completion, could not produce a signal strong enough to reach the entire galaxy. The physics were simple and brutal. An omnidirectional broadcast loses power with distance. By the time our signal reached the far side of the galactic arm, it would be indistinguishable from background radiation. We could shout into the void, but the void was too big, and our voice was too small. Peter had a solution. I hated it immediately. He proposed a network of synchronized nuclear detonations in the upper atmosphere, 27 devices positioned at precise coordinates around the globe, detonated in a specific sequence timed to the millisecond. The explosions would generate massive electromagnetic pulses that, if properly shaped and directed, would amplify the signal by a factor of 9,000. The broadcast would be powerful enough to reach not just the far side of the arm, but the far side of the galaxy. Every civilization with a receiver would hear it. But the detonations would fry every unshielded electronic system on the planet, every satellite, every communication relay, every defense grid, every hospital monitor, every air traffic control system, every phone, every computer. After the signal was sent, Earth would go dark. No communications, no technology. No way to see the Silence Fleet coming, no way to coordinate anything, if there was anything left to coordinate. I looked at Peter Holt, this quiet, patient man who had spent 40 years listening to a silent sky, and I said, "You want to blind us?" He said, "I want to make sure they hear us." I took it to Claire. Claire took it to what remained of the world's governments, which by that point was a loose network of military commanders and civilian leaders, communicating through a patchwork of shortwave radios and courier drones. The response was immediate and fractured. Some said no, absolutely not. We cannot sacrifice our remaining defenses, even though our remaining defenses consisted of a handful of orbital platforms that the Silence Fleet would brush aside like dust. Some said yes. What difference does it make? We are dead regardless. Some did not respond at all, and we later learned that several of them had simply walked away from their posts, gone home, and closed their doors. It was Simon Drake who suggested the vote. Not a government vote. Not a military decision. A global referendum. Every person on Earth with access to a working communication device, given 48 hours to answer a single question: should we send the signal, knowing it will leave us blind and defenseless, or should we keep our eyes open and die in silence? I thought the idea was impractical. I thought the infrastructure was too damaged, the population too scattered, the logistics too impossible. I was wrong. In 72 hours, because the 48-hour deadline slipped as more and more people demanded to be heard, 914 million people voted. Not everyone, not even close. Most of the world had no way to participate, but 914 million people found a way to cast a vote, through shortwave radio, through handwritten ballots collected by volunteers on bicycles, through Morse code tapped out on car batteries, through every improvised communication method that human stubbornness could devise. 71% voted yes, send it, let the galaxy hear. I read the results, and I felt something I had not felt in weeks. Not hope. Hope was too strong a word for what we had. What I felt was purpose. 914 million people, staring down their own extinction, had chosen to speak rather than to survive. I do not know if that is courage or madness. I suspect it is both. I suspect it has always been both. We had 14 days left. The record needed a structure. Lucy Barrett led the effort, working with Grace Fielding and a team of archivists and linguists who had stopped keeping track of the hours. They divided the broadcast into 3 layers. Layer 1 was the archive itself, every fragment of every dead civilization we had recovered: the Droon gravitational symphonies, the Pelhari unified field theory, the Ixi legal frameworks, the Keth star poems, the Ferrani shared dreams, the Halani living architecture. 70 civilizations reduced to fragments, assembled into a single stream of data that would take 14 hours to transmit at the bandwidth our array could produce. Lucy insisted on including metadata, context for each fragment, a note explaining which species had created it, when they had lived, and when they had been silenced. She said, "An archive without context is just noise. We need to tell the galaxy who these people were." Layer 2 was Earth's own record. This was the part that made me uncomfortable, because Grace and Lucy insisted that it should not be a highlight reel. They did not want to send our greatest achievements, our finest art, our proudest moments. They wanted to send everything: our wars, our failures, our cruelties, the centuries of slavery and conquest and destruction, and alongside them, without separation, without apology, the other things: the music, the medicine, the laughter, the way a stranger will run into traffic to save someone else's child, the way an old man will plant a tree he knows he will never sit beneath, unedited, unfiltered, the full, contradictory, messy, infuriating truth of what it means to be human. I argued against it. I said we should present our best face, that if this was our last communication with the universe, we should at least try to look good. Lucy Barrett looked at me with the patient exhaustion of a woman who had spent her life surrounded by documents and knew that the only thing worse than the truth was a polished version of the truth. She said, "Daniel, the ascendancy has been judging species for millennia. They decide who is worthy of existence based on criteria that no one else gets to see. If we send them a curated version of ourselves, we are playing their game. We are saying, look, we are good enough, we deserve to live. We are not going to beg. We are going to show them what we are, every terrible, beautiful, honest piece of it, and the galaxy can judge for itself." I could not argue with that. I did not want to argue with that. She was right, and I was afraid, and being afraid is not a reason to be dishonest. Layer 3 was the spoken message, one voice, one statement, delivered in every language we could manage, and accompanied by a translation key for species that did not share our linguistic structures. Someone had to record it. The team discussed candidates: a world leader, a poet, a child, a scientist. Each suggestion was proposed and rejected, not because any of them were wrong, but because none of them were right. The message was not about authority or beauty or innocence or knowledge. It was about witness. It was about standing at the edge of the abyss and saying what you saw before the darkness took you. Claire Whitman told me on day 63 that I was going to record it. I told her she was out of her mind. She said, You are the operational lead. You have seen every fragment. You have read every translation. You know what we are sending and why. You are not the most eloquent person on this planet, Daniel, but you are the most honest, and honest is what we need. I wrote the message in 4 hours. I rewrote it in 6. I threw away both versions and sat in an empty room for 2 hours, staring at a wall, trying to find the words. In the end, I did not write anything. I walked into the recording booth, sat down in front of the microphone, and I spoke. I said, "This is Earth. We are the 73rd species on the Valeth Ascendancy's Purge Corridor Manifest. By the time you hear this, we may already be gone. But this message is not about us. In the months before our scheduled erasure, we found something. Fragments. Echoes. The last traces of the civilizations that were silenced before us. We found Drumeen music, and Pelhari science, and Ixi philosophy, and the poetry of the Keth, and the dreams of the Pharaoni, and the living buildings of the Holani. We found children's songs and love letters, and mathematical proofs, and legal arguments for the right to exist. We found what the Ascendancy tried to erase, and we put it in this signal. Every piece we could recover is here. This is not a weapon. This is not a plea. This is a record. This is proof that they lived. If you destroy Earth, you destroy the only copy. We are the last witness. Whatever you do to us, you cannot undo what we have already sent. The dead are speaking. Listen. I played it back once. My voice sounded tired and raw and ordinary. It sounded like a person, not a leader, not a hero. Grace Fielding, who was standing behind me, said, "It is perfect." Day 67, 7 days before the estimated arrival of the Silence Fleet. The antenna network was at 81%, which Peter Holt said was enough. Not ideal, not optimal, but enough. The nuclear devices were in position. The record was compiled, layer upon layer of data, 14 hours of broadcast material, compressed and structured and tagged and ready. The morning of the transmission was the quietest morning of my life. The sky above the Atacama was clear and empty and impossibly blue. I stood outside the bunker and watched the sun rise, and I thought about the Druni, who had composed music from the movements of stars, and I thought about how they would have described this sunrise, and I thought about how I would never know. At 1100 hours, I gave the order. The antenna network activated. Every dish, every transmitter, every satellite, still functioning in orbit, turned in unison and locked onto the same vector, which was every vector, all of them, everywhere. Peter Holt's console lit up green, one station after another reporting synchronization. Across the planet, the nuclear devices armed, 27 points of light waiting to be born. I said, "Send it." The detonations were beautiful. I know that is a strange word for a chain of nuclear explosions, but I do not have a better one. 27 blooms of light in the upper atmosphere, spaced across the globe like a necklace, each one precisely timed, each one feeding its energy into the electromagnetic pulse that carried the record outward at the speed of light. From the ground, it looked like a second sunrise, white and brilliant and absolute. The sky burned. The air tasted of metal and ozone. Every screen in the facility went black. Every radio died. Every satellite above us went silent, one by one, like candles being snuffed. And the signal went out. 14 hours of data, compressed into a beam so powerful that Peter Holt said it would be detectable at the edge of the observable universe. The Drune symphonies, the Pelhari equations, the Ixi arguments, the Kuneth poems, the Pharaoni dreams, the Holani structures. Earth's own record, warts and all, blood and beauty, and everything in between, and my voice, tired and honest and afraid, saying, "Listen, listen, listen." When the transmission ended, we were in darkness. The bunker ran on backup generators, chemical batteries, and emergency lighting. The surface was silent, no satellites, no communications, no radar, no defense grid. We were blind, and the Silence Fleet was somewhere out there in the dark, coming closer. I sat in the operations center, in the amber glow of emergency lanterns, surrounded by my team, and I waited. There was nothing else to do. We had said what we needed to say. The rest was not up to us. 12 hours after the transmission ended, Simon Drake grabbed my arm. He was standing next to the one piece of equipment we had deliberately shielded from the electromagnetic pulse. An old analog receiver, vacuum tubes, and copper wire. The kind of technology that predated transistors, that Peter Holt had insisted on protecting because, he said, someone might answer. Someone was answering. The signal was faint, buried in static, barely distinguishable from noise. But it was structured, it was intentional. It was a response. Simon adjusted the frequency, and the signal sharpened, and then there was another one behind it, on a different frequency, and another, and another. I stood in that dark bunker, surrounded by dead screens and chemical light, and I listened to the galaxy wake up. The first signal we identified came from a system 1,400 light-years away, a red dwarf star that no human telescope had ever studied, orbited by a gas giant with 17 moons. The signal was a simple repeating pattern, a mathematical sequence, primes followed by a harmonic structure that Grace Fielding recognized immediately. It was Droon. Not a human retransmission, not an echo of our broadcast. It was new Droon music, composed in a style consistent with the fragments we had sent, but unmistakably original, a continuation of a tradition that the Ascendancy had declared extinct 4 months ago. Grace dropped her headphones. She looked at me. She said, "Daniel, someone survived." The implications hit me like a wall. The Ascendancy's purges were supposed to be absolute, complete. No survivors, no remnants, no seeds from which a dead culture could regrow. But here was proof, singing proof, mathematical proof, that the Droon had not been entirely destroyed. Somewhere in the galaxy, hidden in the shadow of a gas giant, around a star nobody watched, Droon survivors had been listening. And when they heard their own music broadcast back to them from a planet they had never heard of, they answered. Over the next 72 hours, as Simon Drake and Peter Holt coaxed every last bit of sensitivity from our shielded analog receiver, the responses multiplied. Each one was different. Each one came from a different direction, a different distance, a different species. Some were mathematical sequences. Some were fragments of language. Some were simple pings, the barest possible transmission, just enough to say, "We are here." I counted them as they came in. 14 in the first day, 31 by the end of the second, 87 by the third morning. Each number represented a civilization, a culture, a species that had survived the Ascendancy's purges by doing the one thing the Ascendancy never anticipated: disappearing, going silent, collapsing their technology, burying their transmitters, retreating into moons and asteroid fields, and the dense atmospheres of gas giants, and the dark spaces between stars where no one looked. They had survived by becoming invisible, by building entire cultures around the principle of silence, by teaching their children that the greatest virtue was to make no sound, to cast no shadow, to leave no trace. For hundreds of years, some of them for thousands, they had hidden. They had watched the Ascendancy's fleets pass overhead and held their breath and said nothing. They had let their neighbors die without a word, not because they did not care, but because speaking meant dying, and dying meant that no one would remember them either. Silence was survival. Silence was the only strategy that worked. And now, a species from an unremarkable planet around an unremarkable star had shattered that silence with a 14-hour broadcast containing the voices of the dead. On the fourth day, we received the transmission that changed everything. It came from the Droon survivors, and it was not music. It was data, star charts, navigation coordinates, tactical information. The transmission contained the locations of the Silence Fleet's power relays, the network of energy stations scattered across the galactic arm that fueled the fleet's operations. It contained the fleet's communication frequencies, its coordination protocols, its refueling schedules. It contained the locations of the fleet's sensor blind spots, the gaps in its detection network where a ship could pass without being seen. Claire Whitman decoded it in under an hour. She looked at me, and for the first time since I had known her, she smiled. Not a happy smile, a fierce smile. The smile of a woman who had spent her entire career preparing for a fight she thought she would never get. She said, "They are giving us the map." More data followed from other sources. The Pelhari survivors sent mathematical models of the Silence Fleet's shield harmonics. frequencies at which the shields were weakest, resonance patterns that could be exploited. The ICSI survivors sent an analysis of the Ascendancy's command structure, identifying the decision-making protocols that the fleet relied on, the specific communication patterns that coordinated the ship's movements. Each piece of information was incomplete on its own. Together, they formed something that no single species had ever possessed, a comprehensive intelligence profile of the Vayleth Ascendancy's military apparatus. They were not sending weapons, they were sending knowledge. The kind of knowledge that the Ascendancy had spent millennia ensuring no one would ever accumulate, because knowledge was dangerous, and shared knowledge was revolutionary. I asked Grace why they were doing it. Why now, after centuries of hiding, after building entire civilizations on the foundation of silence, were they breaking their own cardinal rule? Grace said, "Because you did something no one has ever done before. You remembered them, you found the fragments of the dead, and you put them in a signal, and you said their names. For the first time in galactic history, the dead have a voice, and the living heard it, and they realized that silence is not survival. Silence is just a slower form of erasure. There was a Holani colony hidden in the rings of a distant gas giant, 14,000 survivors living in structures that had grown into the ice and rock over 6 centuries. They had been silent for so long that their language had evolved to be spoken in whispers. When they received the record, when they heard the fragments of Holani architecture, described and catalogued by a species that had never seen a Holani building, they broke their 600-year silence with a single broadband transmission that contained the complete plans for a Holani living structure, a building that could grow, adapt, repair itself, and shelter 1,000 people. They sent it to everyone, not to Earth specifically, to every receiver in range, a gift to a galaxy they had been hiding from for longer than most human civilizations had existed. The Farani survivors, a group of fewer than 2,000 living in a hollowed-out asteroid, sent something that made Grace Fielding sit down and cover her face with her hands. It was a continuation of the love letter we had included in the record. The fragment we had found: "I have walked beside you in every dream I have ever had, and I will walk beside you in every dream I will never have." The Farani responded with the next line, the line that had been lost when their world was destroyed, the line that no one in the galaxy had read in 400 years. "Then let us walk together in the dreams of those who come after, so that even when we are forgotten, our footsteps remain." I read that, and I understood something that I had not understood before. The record was not a monument. It was not a memorial. It was a match. We had struck it, and the silence was the fuel, and the galaxy was catching fire. But the fire had a cost. The Ascendancy noticed. Of course they noticed. A 14-hour omnidirectional broadcast from a scheduled species, followed by a cascade of responses from species that were supposed to be extinct, was not something that could be overlooked. The Silence Fleet adjusted its course. It accelerated. The estimated arrival in Sol was revised from 7 days to 4, then to 3. And something else was happening, something I did not expect. The hidden species were not just talking to Earth. They were talking to each other. For the first time, the survivors of different purge cycles, species separated by centuries and light years, were in direct communication. The Droon were sharing data with the Pelhari. The ICSI were coordinating with the Holani. The Farani were linking their communication systems with the Keth. A network was forming, fragile, chaotic, held together by analog signals and improvised relay points, and the sheer desperate refusal to be silent for one more day. It was not a military alliance. It was not a government. It was something messier and more human than that, which is a strange thing to say about a network of alien civilizations, but I do not have a better word. It was a community of survivors who had been alone for so long that they had forgotten what it felt like to be heard, and who were now, suddenly, deafeningly, beautifully, heard. On the 6th day after the transmission, the Silence Fleet entered the Sol system. I walked outside the bunker and looked up. The sky was wrong. The stars were disappearing, one by one, blotted out by shapes so large that they registered not as objects but as absences. 800 ships. The Silence Fleet did not look like a fleet. It looked like the sky was being erased, which, I suppose, was exactly the point. I stood there, in the dark, under a sky that was being swallowed, and I said to no one in particular, They came to make us quiet. They have no idea what we have already done. I went back inside to listen to the galaxy burn. The Silence Fleet took up a standard formation around Earth, the same geometry it had used for every purge in recorded history. 800 ships arranged in a sphere, each one positioned to cover a specific sector of the planet's surface, each one linked to every other through a communications network, so precise that the fleet operated as a single organism. Claire Whitman had described it to me once, early in the project, before we had any real intelligence. She had said, "They do not fight, they coordinate. Every ship knows what every other ship is doing. Every weapon fires in sync. Every shield adjusts in real time. You cannot surprise them because they do not have gaps. It is not a fleet, it is a machine." That description was accurate. What Claire had not known at the time, what none of us had known until the hidden species began sharing their intelligence, was that the machine had a weakness. Not a flaw exactly, a dependency. The Ascendancy's coordination system relied on clean communication channels. The ships exchanged data constantly, millions of packets per second, adjusting formation, targeting, shield harmonics, and energy distribution in real time. If those channels were disrupted, the machine did not break, but it stuttered. And a machine that stutters is no longer a machine. It is a collection of parts. I did not give the order. I need to be clear about that. What happened next was not a military operation. It was not planned by any single person or species. It was the network, the messy, fragile, improvised network of survivor civilizations that had formed in the days after the record was broadcast, acting in concert for the first time. Not because anyone commanded them, because they chose to. The jamming began 12 minutes after the Silence Fleet completed its formation. From every direction, from hidden transmitters buried in moons and asteroids, and the upper atmospheres of gas giants scattered across the galactic arm, the survivor species began broadcasting. Not random noise, not electronic countermeasures. The record. They broadcast the record itself, the same 14-hour archive that Earth had sent, directly into the Silence Fleet's communication frequencies. Every channel the fleet used to coordinate was suddenly flooded with the voices of the dead. Droon music on the targeting frequencies, Pelhari mathematics on the shield harmonics channels, Ixi legal arguments on the command networks, the Qeth star poems on the navigation bands. Every frequency, every protocol, every communication pathway that the fleet relied on to function as a single organism was saturated with the cultural output of the civilizations the Ascendancy had tried to erase. I sat in the dark bunker, listening on our shielded receiver, and I heard it. I heard the Ascendancy's communication network drown, not in static, not in noise, in beauty, in the accumulated wisdom and art and love of 70 dead civilizations, playing on loop, inescapable, impossible to filter, because the survivor species had studied the fleet's protocols for centuries and knew exactly how to inject a signal that the fleet's systems could not distinguish from legitimate traffic. The effect was immediate. The Silence Fleet's formation, which had been perfect, which had always been perfect, began to drift. Not dramatically, not catastrophically, but enough. Ships that had been positioned with millimeter precision shifted by meters, then by hundreds of meters. Targeting arrays that had been locked onto surface coordinates lost their alignment. Shield harmonics that had been synchronized across the entire fleet fell out of phase. Claire Whitman, monitoring the fleet's movements through passive optical sensors, the only detection capability we had left, said, "They are confused. The formation is degrading. They cannot coordinate." Peter Holt, standing beside her, said, "It will not last. They will adapt. They will find a way to filter the signal." He was right. The Ascendancy had not survived for millennia by being fragile. Their systems would adapt. Their engineers would find countermeasures. The jamming was not a permanent solution. It was a disruption. A moment of confusion in a machine that had never been confused before. But moments matter, especially when you are not the only one counting on them. On the 7th day after the transmission, 12 days after the fleet entered the Sol system, the hidden species did something that no one, not the Ascendancy, not the network, not even the species themselves, had planned. They emerged. I cannot describe what it looked like, because I did not see it. Earth's satellites were dead. Our telescopes were down. Everything I know about what happened in the outer system, I learned later, from transmissions intercepted by the network's relay stations, from accounts provided by the survivor species themselves, from the fragments of data that filtered back to us over the weeks and months that followed. What I can tell you is this: across the galactic arm, from hiding places that had been sealed for centuries, ships began to move. Not warships, not battle fleets, cargo vessels with engines that had not been fired in 300 years, mining tugs converted into transports, science vessels with hull patches older than most human nations, Holani living ships that were more plant than metal, grown rather than built, fragile and slow and utterly unsuited for combat. They did not come to fight. Most of them could not fight. They came to be seen. They came out of the shadows and the silence and the hiding places, and they turned on their transmitters, and they broadcast their names and their locations and their existence to every receiver in range. They said, "We are here. We are alive. We are watching." The Ascendancy's Purge Corridor system was built on a simple principle. Extinction happens in the dark. No witnesses, no records, no one watching. The machine works because no one sees it work. Every purge in the history of the Ascendancy had occurred in isolation, one species at a time, with no outside observers, no documentation, no accountability. The dead left no trace, and the living looked away, and the silence was maintained. Now the silence was broken, and the witnesses were everywhere. The Silence Fleet's command structure faced a calculation that it had never been required to make. It could proceed with the purge of Earth. Its weapons were functional. Its ships, despite the communication disruption, were individually capable of carrying out their assigned tasks. The fleet could sterilize the planet. That was never in question. But it could not do so in silence. Every survivor species in the network was broadcasting, open channels, full transparency. Every sensor they had was pointed at Sol, recording everything. If the fleet destroyed Earth, the destruction would be witnessed, documented, and transmitted across the galaxy. The record, which contained the voices of 70 dead civilizations, would be joined by a 73rd entry, and this time, the entry would include full sensor logs of the destruction. Every other species in the galaxy, not just the survivors but the neutral species, the allied species, the species that had looked the other way for millennia because looking was dangerous, would see what the Ascendancy did, not hear about it, not suspect it, see it. The Ascendancy did not feel guilt. I want to be clear about that. Nothing in their behavior suggested remorse or moral hesitation. They were not swayed by the beauty of the Droon symphonies, or the elegance of the Pelhari equations, or the justice of the Ixi arguments. They were swayed by math. The math said that destroying Earth in front of witnesses would transform the Purge Corridor from an efficient, invisible process into a galactic spectacle. It would prove everything the record claimed. It would validate every fragment, every accusation, every whispered rumor about the Ascendancy that had circulated for millennia. It would make the record not just a memorial, but evidence. The fleet held position for 6 days. 6 days during which I sat in a dark bunker, breathing recycled air, eating cold rations, listening to the hiss of static on our receiver, and waiting for the world to end. 6 days during which the network broadcast continuously, filling every frequency with the voices of the dead and the living. A wall of sound that wrapped around the Sol system like a shield made of memory. On the 13th day after their arrival, the Silence Fleet withdrew. Not a retreat. The Ascendancy does not retreat. The official designation, intercepted later by the network's intelligence analysts, was operational postponement pending communications review. A bureaucratic phrase for a bureaucratic empire. They would be back. Everyone knew they would be back. The Ascendancy was patient. They had been patient for millennia. They could wait. But waiting is not the same as winning. And for the first time in recorded galactic history, the machine had been stopped. Not by force, not by superior technology, not by a weapon, by a signal, by the refusal of a doomed species to die in silence, and the decision to spend its last days not building a bomb, but building a record, a testament, a proof of life for civilizations that the universe had been told never existed. The weeks after the withdrawal were strange and difficult and filled with a kind of exhausted wonder that I do not have good words for. The network held. The survivor species did not go silent again. They could not. Once you have spoken after centuries of silence, going back is not just difficult, it is impossible. The silence was broken, and breaking it had changed the shape of the galaxy. Ships began to arrive in the Sol system. Small ships, old ships, ships that looked like they had been held together by hope and welding torches. Druman scientists bringing the rest of their gravitational harmonic archive, the complete symphonies, not fragments but the full works, restored from hidden memory cores that had been buried in ice for 400 years. Pelhari engineers offering to share their unified field theory, the entire proof, not in their visual mathematical language, but translated into formats that other species could use. ICSI legal scholars proposing a framework for the network, a set of principles for governing a community of survivor civilizations, based on their ancient concept of justice, the obligation of the strong to be questioned by the weak. The Halani sent seeds, living seeds that, when planted in soil or ice or rock, would grow into structures that could shelter people from the cold of space. They sent enough seeds to build a city. They sent them with a message that said, "We have been growing in the dark for 600 years. It is time to grow in the light." Earth began to rebuild. Slowly, painfully. The electromagnetic pulse had destroyed most of our technology, and starting over from vacuum tubes and copper wire was not fast or glamorous. But we were not starting alone. The knowledge that flowed in from the network, the accumulated science and engineering of dozens of civilizations, accelerated our recovery in ways that I still do not fully understand. Within a month, we had restored basic communications. Within 3 months, we had a functioning orbital satellite network, built with a combination of human engineering and Pelhari physics and Halani biological construction techniques. And the record kept traveling. That is the thing about a signal. Once you send it, you cannot take it back. The record was moving outward at the speed of light, expanding in every direction, reaching new systems every day, carrying the voices of the dead to corners of the galaxy that even the Ascendancy had never explored. Every day, the sphere of the record grew larger. Every day, more civilizations heard it. Every day, the silence got smaller. People ask me if we won. I tell them no, we did not win. The Ascendancy is still out there. Their fleet is still vast. Their power is still immense. They will come back. Maybe not tomorrow. Maybe not in my lifetime. But they will come back. Because empires do not forgive, and the Ascendancy has never forgiven anything. What we did was something smaller than winning and bigger than surviving. We reminded the galaxy that silence is a choice. For millennia, silence had been the only strategy, the only way to survive, the only response to a power so overwhelming that resistance seemed not just futile, but absurd. And we, a species that had been spacefaring for less than a century, a species that still argued about which economic system was best, a species that could not agree on the temperature of a room, looked at the silence and said no. Not because we were brave, not because we were special, because we had seen what the silence cost. We had read the fragments. We had translated the lullabies and the love letters and the mathematical proofs. We knew what was lost, and we refused to let it be lost quietly. The record is still out there, still expanding, still carrying the Drucon symphonies and the Pelhari equations, and the ICSI arguments, and the Qeth poems, and the Farani dreams, and the Holani seeds, and Earth's own messy, honest, unedited truth. It is moving at the speed of light, which means that nothing in the universe can outrun it. The Ascendancy can burn worlds. They can silence species. They can erase every database and scrub every record, and make it as if a civilization never existed. But they cannot catch a signal that has already passed them by. They cannot unhear what has already been heard. They cannot unknow what has already been known. The dead are louder than the living now. Their voices are in the signal, still traveling, still reaching, still touching new ears and new minds in places we will never see. Every day the record moves farther. Every day the silence gets thinner. Every day the galaxy remembers a little more. I am an old man now. I have lived longer than I expected to, which is the quiet punchline of this whole story. The man who led a project designed for a species with no future woke up one morning and found that the future was still happening, and it needed things like grocery lists and dental appointments, and someone to fix the leak in the roof. Life, it turns out, does not stop being mundane just because you have done something extraordinary. The universe does not care about your resume. But sometimes, late at night, I walk outside, and I look up at the sky, and I think about the signal. I think about it moving through the dark, carrying its cargo of music and mathematics and poetry and truth, touching stars I will never visit, reaching minds I will never meet. And I think about the Droom lullaby, 4 notes repeating in a pattern that shifts to match the breathing of a sleeping child, and I think about how that lullaby is still traveling, still singing, still reaching across distances that dwarf everything humanity has ever imagined. And I think about the Ferrani love letter, the one that ends with footsteps in the dreams of those who come after. And I think maybe that is what the record is. Not a weapon, not a shield, not a monument. Just footsteps. Proof that someone walked here. Proof that someone lived. Proof that someone, at the very end, when there was nothing left to do and nowhere left to go, chose to be loud. The galaxy remembers now, and the silence will never be the same.